Most people have an idea of God that sucks. It's a bad theology. It doesn't fit the majority of Scripture. It doesn't fit our deepest moral intuitions, and it doesn't help us get along with each other in our society.
This week on the Midlife Awareness Podcast, we welcome aboard Thomas Jay Oord and talk about his book, God Can't. Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Midlife Awareness Podcast. Thank you again for joining us. And today we got a special treat. We got Thomas Jay Oord here today. Thomas, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for the opportunity to chat.
Well, thank you for coming on board. And we're going to be talking about Thomas's book called God Can't. A very short title, but a very, very pronounced book. I enjoyed the book. I think, Tom, sometimes in the culture that we're in right now, sometimes I think we have to kind of take a break and say, because when people read that title, it kind of like going, okay, so what kind of blasphemy is coming out of here, right?
Yeah.
So it is a very good book. And just because you can't necessarily go by the title, but it doesn't mean that God's not good. It doesn't mean that God's not great. We can lean a lot of things on God. It's just I felt that it was a really good and easy book to get through. And quite honestly, I think it was a necessary book. And I encourage people to go out and to get this book, to go through it. We are going to go through the main areas of interest in the book. You have 5 of them in there, so we'll go through that here in a minute. But what I want you to do to start off with, Tom, is just to give us an idea of why you felt the need to write the book. What were some of the things going on in your life, and what led to the circumstances for this?
Yeah, maybe the way to answer that is to give you a brief background and then kind of come up right to the writing of the book.
Okay.
I was raised in a little farming community in eastern Washington state. My father was raised in the Dutch Calvinist tradition. He was in the Dutch Reformed denomination. And my mother was a Pentecostal holiness girl in the Church of the Nazarene. They got married and had 3 kids. I'm the middle of those, and they chose to attend a little Church of the Nazarene in Othello, Washington. So I grew up in a fairly loving community, fairly loving home, uh, encouraged to think deeply and get good grades, participate in sports, all that sort of stuff. But I found that I had lots of questions, and I wasn't afraid to ask those questions. And one of them is the question that most people probably ask, at least most people who believe that there's a God. And that's the question: if there is a God who is perfectly loving and perfectly powerful, then why are there evils in the world, unnecessary suffering, pointless pain? And I started asking that question early on. I can remember as a junior high student asking that question and getting some answers that sounded okay to me, others not so much, but never having like the perfect answer. And
Right.
a lot of people appealing to mystery, well, you just don't understand God, so don't expect to get an answer. When I got older, I continued my quest, getting degrees in theology, even up through a PhD, and began to think that the best chance of solving this big, big question, the number one reason atheists say they can't believe God exists, the best way to go about this is to rethink God's power. I wanted to believe and still believe that God is perfectly loving, loves everyone and everything all the time. And I didn't doubt that there were genuine evils in the world. So I had to rethink God's power. And I did it in a kind of a more academic way in a book called The Uncontrolling Love of God. But when people read the book, many of them really liked it. It won some awards, etc. But they said, this is not really the kind of book I could give my friend. And so they said, why don't you write a book we could give our mothers who don't have a theology degree and they could understand it? And so that's what got me to write God Can't. Now, God Can't is different from the uncontrolling love of God in that there are some new ideas in there that aren't in the previous books. But this is an articulation in accessible language of the key ideas that I think actually solve the big question of why a loving and powerful God doesn't stop genuine evil.
Now, is these ideas that you came up on your own?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I came up with my own. I've been working at this in conversation with lots of people over time. But the details of the ideas, I would say, are original, especially the idea that God can't prevent evil because God's nature is love and God's love is uncontrolling. I didn't get that from anybody else. But the notion that I should rethink God's power, other people had suggested that, or I had read that in books. And so I'd been toying around with that for a while.
So, what we're going to do now is go into the 5 areas of the books. And your 5 areas for God Can't are, first of all, you just mentioned God can't prevent evil. God feels our pain. God works to heal. God squeezes good from our bad. And God needs our cooperation. So, really, the gist of this book, I think there's a couple of 3 different types of areas that this book can hit. And one of them is this is primarily a book about evil and how we deal with evil. I don't think that any of us really growing up have really been taught, I don't think, to really deal with evil or what happens, and I think all of us have had those questions. Okay, so if you're really in control here, what's going on? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why are we going through this? So, I can remember this happened some years ago, but this happened, to me in my life. I went through a divorce about 10 years or so ago. And, again, I grew up very conservative. I grew up in a Baptist church, and, believing the fact that God's in control all the time, right?
Yep.
And so you go through this process of, okay, well, God, if you're up there, if you're in control, then why am I going
Yeah.
through this? Right.
Why this? Right. Yeah. And I think in most Baptist tradition, I don't know your particular story in detail, but many Baptists have wanted to say that God's in control. And by that, they mean whatever we mean by free will, it doesn't really mean we can act other than what God wants us to act. And so going through a divorce or being the survivor or victim of some kind of harm that's caused by people's actions. It's easy for people in a Baptist or a tradition that doesn't have I'll call it a high view of free will. It's easy for them to think, well, why didn't God stop this by overcoming the other person's free agency? And in the tradition I grew up in, free will was a big thing. And so I could just hear your story of divorce and say, well, the reason that evil happened is because of the misuse of free will. And again, I don't know the details of
Right.
your
Right.
relationship, but the free will answer doesn't solve a bunch of other questions like why didn't God stop the pandemic or natural disasters or stillborn or miscarriages or all kinds of other things that don't seem to involve anybody's misuse of free agency. So I just thought I'd throw that in quickly to say I
Yeah.
can totally understand why going through a divorce would raise those issues. But to the listener who says, well, that's just a misuse of free will, the problem of evil is bigger than just the free will question.
Yeah, and the other side of that too is that we're not really supposed to question a lot of things,
Yeah.
and that's the
Yeah.
other thing too, people go through hard times in life and we're just supposed to sit back and accept it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yep.
so start us off here. One question I did have is what harm do you see in a classic ideology of Christianity when it comes to God's love?
Well, there's some really big ones that folks might be thinking of, and we've already mentioned one of them being that God is in control. Usually that's linked to a certain view of God's power we call omnipotence. And classical theologians have wanted to say God is omnipotent in some sense. Either God is controlling everything, or at least God could control if God wanted to. And even if you have that second view, you still have the big questions of evil, because you have to say, well, if God could control it to stop that rape, then wouldn't it be loving for God to do so? So the questions of God's power in classical theism are really big. But there are other issues related to God in classical theology that create real problems for love. One of them is that the love that you and I experience in our relationships with one another involves not just giving, but also receiving, a kind of reciprocity or mutuality, influencing others, but being influenced by others. But the God of classical theology is never influenced by anything at all times.
Hmm.
The technical word is, this God is impassible, unaffected,
Hmm.
and has no emotions in relation to creation, which doesn't fit the biblical witness, but is the way that classical theology thinks about God. I could list a bunch of other things too, like, the classical God sends people to hell for eternity, which doesn't seem particularly loving to me. But there's all kinds of problems with, I'll call it, a conventional or a traditional view of God.
Now, this book talks a lot really about evil, and basically how to deal with evil, and a lot of, and I think we've gone through this already, but questions arise when we go through hard times. And so one of the biggest issues obviously is God can't prevent evil.
Yeah.
I know that's a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp onto, but I think now, especially going through that book, it does make a lot of sense. I think a lot of times that we put a lot of stuff on God that, doesn't need to be there.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I guess another reason why I'm here, we're doing this podcast right now, is I just do not like where we are politically,
Mm.
um, in such a polarized society right now,
Mhm.
where you have mainly two political parties, and each one belongs to one, and each one says that the other political party is evil.
Mm.
Um, so you don't really write much about it in this book, but where do you kind of stand on where you kind of stand on that issue as far as some of the political stuff that's going on?
Yeah, I don't belong to any political party officially. I don't vote for one ticket in all circumstances. I try to judge things case by case and let love be my guide. So I ask the question, what seems to be the most loving thing to do, in the sense that what actions might promote well-being or the common good? That's kind of I'm not saying this is, clearly lines me up with every single candidate or issue,
Right,
whatever,
right,
but
right.
I try to let love be my guide. I think a lot of what happens in the contemporary world, in terms of US politics at least, is that people are posturing and posing and trying to appeal to a particular kind of voter so that they get reelected or maybe elected for the first time. And sometimes being super extreme is what gets the most news and therefore is the most effective campaign strategy. And that in part leads to a lot of the major bipartisanship, or not bipartisanship, partisanship in politics. I find that some politicians are able to get things done behind closed doors as long as they can posture to the world that they're really rigid in this one particular view. It's a really unfortunate situation we're in our society, and I suspect the only way to easily get out of this quagmire is to somehow honor, praise, vote for, encourage those candidates who can be honest and actually compromise in public. And that's at the present moment, there's just not much of that going on, at least publicly.
Yeah, you're right there. And those are all good, solid points. What I'd like to do sometime down the road, I know dominionism is really starting to take. Now, I don't know if this is how long this has been, but it's really starting to take a hold of our politics. And I'd like to, at some point down the road, find somebody that's well versed in that and have an episode on that, because I can I can see it. It's starting to take over, not our schools even. I mean, it's coming into our schools now and all of that. So I've seen that.
I live in Idaho, so
Yeah.
we're a pretty red state, and this ideology is affecting school boards in my little town.
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Maybe, one of my recent books, I've got a whole section on omnipotence and politics.
Okay.
Maybe we can address that in a future
Okay.
conversation.
Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds good for sure. Yeah, because I'm seeing it here in where I'm at in Lee Summit, Missouri. I'm even seeing it in our local school districts now. So
Yeah.
um in one of my early episodes, I spoke with a guy named Dr. Wes Parham, and he wrote a book called Be a Hater. Now, again, for some reason, I think I'm attracted to books that have like titles that it's just like, what are you talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It just throws readers off. But the premise of that book is that a lot of our language has evolved. A lot of our languages have changed. So his whole concept was the hater mindset, and how now today, if you have anybody that tries to disagree with you, they basically just shut you down. They shut you out. They want nothing to do with you, right? And his idea is that we need to get back to this idea where we can allow people to have a difference of opinion and not hate them, right?
yeah.
We're just human beings. We may have a different way of looking at things. So, but you mentioned a couple of areas, and I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to take a couple of quotes from your book. I think deconstruction is one of those words. I think we've got either a misinterpretation, or maybe it's just such a polarized word that people just, as soon as you say it, people like go in shock. But because a lot of times I think they think deconstruction means, well, you're going away from your faith. You're losing your faith. You're turning away from God if you deconstruct. And I almost look at it as now where it might be possible to step back and just rethink your theology, rethink where you're at.
Yep.
A couple of quotes you had in your book was, to reconstruct our thinking and living, we need to change the way we think and live. And that's pretty profound. And if we reconstruct our thinking and living, we need to change the way we believe and act. To be transformed, we must reform our beliefs. Do you think it is necessary today, where we're at, to deconstruct at some point?
For most people, yes. Most people have an idea of God that sucks. It's a bad theology. It doesn't fit the majority of Scripture. It doesn't fit our deepest moral intuitions, and it doesn't help us get along with each other in our society. This traditional or conventional view of God is one that doesn't make sense of the afterlife, doesn't fit well with most of the sciences, and I think we need to deconstruct it. Now, it could be that someone's got a view of God that I think is quite, reasonable, plausible, and they've been taught that since they were young. But 99.9% of the people I meet, they're not like that. And so, what happens to many people is the view of God that they've been given, either through their parents, through their church, or just through sort of the general culture, it comes face to face with some problem. Maybe it's a problem in their own lives. Maybe it's the national conversation on politics. Maybe they go through some kind of abusive situation in a church or at the hands of a sexual partner or something like that. And the ideas they had about God comes face to face with reality. And many of those people say, okay, I've got a choice. I can either give up belief in God, or I can retain this belief and it be out of step with how the world seems to really work. And they think it's an either or choice. Keep the same view of God or just give it up entirely. I think there's a third alternative, and that is to give up the particular view of God you have, but look for one that makes better sense given reality. Or as the book that I'm currently writing is titled, God After Deconstruction. What kind of God makes sense after we look at questions of evil, of national politics, of questions of science, of questions about sexuality and gender, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a much more fruitful way to go at the God question than the either or of keep the same old God that you were taught when you were young or have no God whatsoever.
But that kind of now gets back into an idea that, well, and I'm going to actually go through this here in just a second about, well, we should see the God of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't have to be able to make up our own version or whatever of who God is or what God is. We should go
Yeah, I
we
have
should go
two
with the Bible.
responses. I
Yeah.
have two responses to that. First, no one comes to the Bible with a blank slate. That is, we all read the Bible through a particular lens, and that's been the case ever since the Bible was written. And the way that the average person today interprets the Bible is vastly different from the way people interpret the Bible during Martin Luther's day, for instance. So it's not that, the Bible is this objective thing and all we've got to do is download all the truths in the Bible and then we got it all figured out. We come to the Bible with particular worldviews and lenses and experiences and perspectives, and that always shapes the way we're going to read it. That's the first point. The second point is, I don't think the Bible has a perfectly consistent view of God. I think some parts of the Bible, for instance, point to a God who's loving, forgiving, who never harms, who always forgives. And there are other stories in which God wants people to bash the baby's heads of their enemies. And those two just don't line up. So we have to make hermeneutical or interpretive choices. And I interpret and believe that the broad themes of the Bible point to a God of love, but I recognize that not every passage does.
One of the earlier um, uh, authors I had on this podcast was John Dominic Crossan, and in one of his books, he mentioned that, which made sense. How we see God is how we're going to. How we see God is how we see Jesus.
Mm.
And so, if you see Jesus of the Bible as a loving loving person, taking care of the needy, taking care of the poor, all that stuff. That's your view of God.
Mm.
Um, I also think that I think that I wonder if that view has changed though. So after the crucifixion and the resurrection, then now we have this picture of the revelation Jesus coming back to, disintegrate the world and to slash all the enemies and stuff like that. And now that's what our view of God is.
Yeah.
Um,
I can see that. We at least some of us make fun of and mock these paintings that we see sometimes as memes on social media of this super buff Jesus with these huge biceps and huge chest muscles with, AK-47s coming out of both sides. He's like the Jesus who's gonna, rip up and be the conqueror. And we think, oh man, that is so 21st century nationalistic. That makes no sense. But throughout Christian history, there have been images of Jesus, at least maybe not with guns, but as this dominating, triumphant king who's coming back to slay his enemies with a sword. So that triumphalist, retributive Jesus is a part of the Christian history as well. I think it's wrong. I think it's the bad view of Jesus, but it's not just a modern or contemporary invention. That option has been around for a while. I think we need to choose a different view.
you mentioned one of the things that drives you crazy in the book about mainstream Christianity is when it had to do with prayer life, when people are sitting there praying and they put "if it be your will" at the end of praying. So um I guess just a basic question to you: do you believe that God has a will?
I do. I think God has a general will, and God's will is that we love one another, love God, love our enemies and strangers, love all of creation. This general will, I think God is calling us to moment by moment. And in each moment, God has a will in the sense of a particular way we might love, given all the options. At this particular moment, I think God's calling me to be as articulate as I can in response to your question about God's will. And so that's loving if I follow that goading or that calling by God in this moment. But I don't think God has a will if you mean that God has like this blueprint of everything that's ever going to happen, that God has foreordained and foreknown from all eternity. I don't think that's a good way of thinking about God's will.
One of the themes also that I found out when reading this book was um was the thought that God can't do anything alone. And I think that I've had some similar ideas to this, but I just didn't really know how to put it into words until um, I came across of who you are and started reading your work, and it all started making sense to me. And I think one of the things I'm having problems with now is I don't I mean, obviously, this isn't a political book, but I'm kind of stuck right now in this part of my life is where I think part of the problems with Christianity is now when it comes down to the political side of it is they're trying to infiltrate the government and have the government take care of um, what we're supposed to take care of.
Mm.
And I mean this by this way. Um, I don't know where your thoughts are on this. I could be I could be coming on dangerous terms right now,
Okay.
but I don't know where you sit on this because it is a very polarizing topic
Yeah.
in today's society. And even mentioning this really sends people aback because and the topic's abortion. Okay.
Okay.
So and if you even bring up that word, For some odd reason, now people are going to think, well, you're supporting abortion if you're talking about it. That's not the case. My thinking is this, though. Reading your book, God can't do anything alone. We are here for a reason, right? God is a spirit. You said that over and over and over in that book. God is a spirit. Okay, so if we go with this theme that God just can't unilaterally go down and stop something, he's depending on his creation to help him out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the free will thing, you mentioned it earlier. Each one of us, and I got another specific question about this in a minute, but we all have our own free will.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. God gave us that free will. So my thinking is this: when it comes down to these type of issues that are prevalent right now in our society, I think God is looking to us to help these people, I guess, going through these situations, not the government. Okay, so our focus now is going to the government, making something illegal, which, I mean, it's not really going to help or hurt anything. But at the same time, what it's doing is it's turning people off to Christianity.
Mm.
And I think I'm going on a tangent here, but there's you see a lot of churches now that are losing their a lot of people have stopped going to church. There's all kinds of studies out there now where churches are starting to decrease, and it's all because where Christianity is on a lot of these issues and stuff like that. And so if we get back to the basis of your book, it's our responsibility to love these people. It's our responsibility to, if they have questions or if they have a need or if they have something like that, it is our responsibility to help them.
Yeah.
It's not the responsibility of the government to make something illegal.
Mm. Well, let me offer you a framework to
Yeah.
think about this. Maybe you won't like the framework, but it's one I find helpful. And it doesn't answer all your questions, but I think it does point toward a general approach to the question of who should help the needy or where should change be made. I like to think of three domains of our lives. The first domain is our own individual choice in the individual activities that go on moment by moment in our lives. And most of that occurs with our family, our coworkers, or the people who are around us day by day. We'll call that the individual choice matter. Now, a lot can happen that's positive or negative
Right.
because of what individuals do. I can
Right.
help someone as an individual that because I'm right there and present that no one else can because they're not there and present. But we all realize that there are some issues in our world that individuals alone can't tackle. It takes a community.
Right.
And one of the best
Exactly.
communities, at least that's functioning well, is the church. But it doesn't have to be a church, it can be some other kind of community. But a group of people who come together, who pool their resources, can tackle bigger issues. And, two is stronger than one. There's lots of ways to talk about how that's true. Now, that's the second domain. And I think we need to not only give ourselves to thinking about what we can do as individuals, but we also need to think about what kind of groups we're in and how those groups can make the world a better place, meet those in need, handle difficulties in life. But then there's some issues that seems like it's going to transcend even our individual group. And that's where we usually bring in the government. And maybe that's questions about laws that you mentioned here earlier, or maybe that's questions about what to do about climate change, or what to do about protecting us from foreign powers, or sort of
Mhm.
these big issues that it seems like individuals and small groups really can't handle very well. Now, my way of thinking is all three of those are important, and we can't cut off any one of them. Sometimes liberals seem to cut off the individual thing and want to sort of foist everything on groups and governments. Other times, more conservative or libertarian people, they want to cut off the government and keep it down to the individuals and small groups.
Mhm.
I think we need to keep all three options on the table. So when it comes to the question, how do we help the poor? How do we help the needy? How do we make life good for the whole? We need to keep all three of those domains on the table. It's not easy to know exactly what laws, rules, situations apply to each of these three, but I don't think we are good if we cut off any of the three. What do you think
One
of
of the
that?
yeah, I think that's good. I really do. I think that there is a need. I think it's where we're at right now. I think where we're at right now is the fact that I can sense where Christianity is trying to take over.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it gets back to the whole dominionism thing, but we won't go back through that again. But
Yeah.
um, and
But
again,
it also it comes down to what you think God is like. If you
right?
think God is large in charge and is hierarchical top
Yes,
down, then you
yeah,
probably want a government that's like that, and you
yeah.
want everyone just to suck up to whoever's in power. But if you think God is a servant like, if you think God is always giving and never controlling like I do, then you have a very different view of what a government that's, you know, guided by God is going to look like.
And I hate to even, and one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast is I need to get to the point where it's like I can talk about things like this without having people, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm necessarily for abortion, right? But to because I want to get into a subject now where I really enjoyed watching the debate that you and Greg Boyd had on the Deep
Oh,
Tracks podcast.
cool.
I
Yeah,
thought
that's a
for
couple years
anybody
ago, maybe. Is that right?
yeah, I can't remember. I think it's either a year or two ago. I can't really remember. But so anybody out there listening, go to the Deep Tracks podcast and pull it up. I thought it was really entertaining. It had a lot to do with evil. In fact, that's what it was. That's what it was about. Is how to deal with this the evil issue. And but Greg made a good point about the free will, right? All this comes down to is we have free will. And so God just can't give us free will and then take it back. What kind of, what kind of I guess what kind of God would that be? We're talking about a loving God or whatever. And so but within that free will becomes our morality.
Mhm.
Okay. So um so if we're given this free will, um God can't just snatch that free will back because then he becomes something that, according to your book, he's not.
Right.
Um, so where does our then so morality is a central issue to our individual life.
Yes, that's right. I think so.
Okay. So now where does our responsibility into come into play when we're trying to control somebody else's free will?
Yeah. I think it's actually impossible for us to control someone else's free will. We may limit it in certain ways, but I don't think we can ever take it away entirely. And I don't think God can ever take away our free will entirely. So the question is, I think the appropriate moral question is, how can we influence other people to use their agency and free will in positive ways? So as a parent, I'm trying to influence my three daughters to want to make positive decisions that will be beneficial for them, others, society, God, etc. If I try to force them to act a certain way and they feel like they don't have any free will, they just have to do what dad tells them to do, then that kind of agency is not going to be robust, and they're not going to take it on themselves as making the kind of moral decisions that are either good or bad. So I think love calls us to influence others, but not try to control them.
One of the sections that you get into this book, again, the 5 areas of the book, we've talked about some of them already. God can't prevent evil. God feels our pain. God works to heal. God squeezes good from our bad, and then God needs our cooperation. In the section about healing, you you had an interesting quote in that section, and you said religious communities are always places where you can feel God's love. But for many people, church is the problem. Too many churches are obstacles to grace rather than channels. Some communities of faith are like Noah's Ark. Their animals dump a lot of crap. Members muck the stalls and clean the cages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At times, the crap rains down, and we are more likely to drown in the ark than we are in open waters.
I'm glad you like that. That was one of my favorite things to write.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So that was in the chapter of healing. Why is there so much confusion when it comes down to the issue with healing, do you think?
Because so many people aren't healed. That's why we're confused.
Well, that's pretty profound. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I've prayed an awful lot for people to heal, myself, but mostly others. And if we judge the effectiveness of my prayers based on how many people were actually healed, my prayers have been largely ineffective. We read all kinds of things in scripture about God being a healing God and all these miracles that happen. And you think, well, why doesn't this happen now? And, some people claim it does happen. But when I walk around with those people, I find out that they're pretty selective in what they actually say. So there's just not enough healing in the world for us to, at least for most of us, to make sense of what God's up to if we think God is omnipotent. If we think God has the power to control any situation, any creature, any circumstance at any time, then what's going on in the world in terms of healing doesn't make a lot of sense.
Hmm.
But if we change our view of God's power and believe that God is active, does want to heal, but there are obstacles, forces, and factors that stand in the way of God's healing, then we make a lot better sense of why our prayers are often not effective in the way that we want them to be. We can say there are agents, factors, actors in the person's body and their environment. There's things going on that even God can't control. And that helps a lot, I think.
You also mentioned that God can't force us to cooperate. I mean, obviously, one of the overarching themes of this book is there's a lot of things that God may want us to do, but He's restricted, or the Spirit is restricted in the cooperation of us, His creation, or whatever. So He can't force us to cooperate, but He needs us to cooperate. And I thought that was pretty profound too, because you never really think of God as somebody who really needs anything.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what conventional or classical theology says. God doesn't need a single thing at all. God can just wholly function and get the job done single-handedly. I find, I'm a theologian, so I read a lot of books and know the history of theology fairly well. And you can see a kind of change over time. Many of the earliest theologians, not all of them, but I'm making a generalization here, many of them thought God was in control in the sense of controlling everything. And the way they talk, it sounds as if you and I are just these robots, or maybe a better image is pawns in a metaphysical chess match between God and Satan. And we really don't have any agency or freedom, but God is sort of controlling everything. And that picture of God is often then replaced with a picture that says you and I do have freedom. We do have agency. God still, though, could be controlling, is omnipotent, but is choosing to allow us to express freedom or allow creation to have some measure of independence. And in that view, and which I think is a very common view today, at least among academic theologians, and I
Mhm.
suspect amongst lots of people in the pews, in that view, because they retain the view that God is omnipotent, while they'll say that what you and I do matters because we have free agency, they'll retain the view that God and omnipotence could get the result God wants single-handedly. And if that's true, whatever agency that we seem to have doesn't really matter, at least doesn't really matter for what's important to God. And what I'm proposing in the last chapter of this book is a third step that says God is active and powerful, but God can't get the results God wants unless creation cooperates, which means that you and I really have free agency, and our free agency really matters. Our lives and choices are significant because what we do has a real impact on whether or not love ultimately wins. And I find that that idea for some people is really liberating. It's
Yeah.
like they say, yes, yeah, my life matters, it counts. But for other people, it's like they hate the idea because they think God has now put the whole world on their shoulders. And if they screw up, then, the whole thing's going down the drain. And I like to say to those latter people, God's not asking you to do everything. The whole world isn't on your shoulders. You have a role to play, a part to play, and what you do really does matter. But don't go around thinking that the whole thing rests upon what you decide to do.
So in the end here, why don't you just go ahead and I guess just give me an um overall mention about the book. Is there anything else that you want to say about the book while we're on here today? I think we've hit some of the major points of it. Obviously, I want people to go out and to get the book and read the book. It is very good.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that,
Yeah,
Dennis.
no, it really was. And like I said, I think it really there was a lot of clarity in my mind. I think when I read this book was the fact that I think that we all have questions.
Yeah.
And I think that and I've said this before, so this shouldn't be a shock to some people, but I just think that I don't know what the big point about having questions is. We should all question stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
And we should get down to the place where it's like, it's good to question even the way we even our religion, even our at some point even our relationships, couples sometimes they question things throughout their relationships. Doesn't mean it's bad, it just means maybe at some point it makes you stronger, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um there's some
Well,
things that we have to get through. So at this point, I just want to give you a chance to, is if there's anything in this book that we haven't talked about that you'd like to just go ahead and sum it up now.
well, I think I'll conclude by saying that I have noticed that this book is helpful to or appeals to four kinds of people. So, folks who are listening or watching this, if you're in one of these four categories, this book might be for you. The first category are people who've been hurt and harmed deeply, maybe by the church, maybe they've been sexually abused, maybe they've gone through a horrific tragedy in their lives, maybe they've had a miscarriage or their family member died of some disease and they've got big God questions based on some major hurt. I get letters practically every week from people in that category who read this book and say, thank God someone finally gave me a good answer. Second group of people These folks maybe haven't gone through a major tragedy, but they're kind of on the margins. They don't fit with the rest of the world, at least in their minds. These people may be in a minority group, racially, ethnically. They may be in a minority group sexually or gender wise. They don't feel like they fit in the mainstream, and they've thought to themselves, well, if God is in control, then I guess I'm on the outside for a reason. And that doesn't feel very good. And this book says, nope, God isn't in control. God didn't put you on the outside. And those people like this book. Third group of people are people who are just in the midst of what we called earlier deconstruction. They no longer find the views of God and ways of living that they once were taught make much sense. And this book offers an alternative way to believe in a loving God, and it's really attractive to those people. And then the fourth group of people are the people I call theology nerds. These are people who are thinking theologically all the time and trying to wrestle with the big God questions. And this is obviously a huge one. And they're attracted to this because it's a novel approach to a question that has plagued people for millennia.
So to end up here, then, why don't you go ahead and give us your how people can get in touch with you, how people can get in touch with your books, websites, or anything like that that you might want to mention at this time?
Yeah, you can find this book on all the major online book retailers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. You can contact me by going to my personal website, which is my full name, Thomas Jay Oord. That's Thomas, then JAYOORD.com. And I'm the kind of person who responds to social media notes or Facebook, Twitter, whatever, X, got to use the right word. So you can contact me there as well.
Well, Tom, thank you so much again for this session. It's been a blessing to me. Your book was a blessing to me, and so we'll try to hammer out something here in the near future, hopefully, and you can come back on and we'll go through some other things. There's a couple of your good books out there, so people go out and check on those. And again, just thank you so much for coming on board. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Ben.